All right, well, our panel has assembled, so I guess it is time to begin. We'll let people filter in. So,
I'll filter in.
Yeah. This is a panel on the many worlds of D&D. I think that's what it ended up getting called. So basically, what I wanted to do was ask a few questions just about to our esteemed panelists, who I'll give them a chance to introduce themselves if you don't know who they are.
Well, I'm David Zeb Cook. Worked at TSR obviously for a very long time. And I created a whole bunch of different worlds or worked in different worlds doing stuff. Most notoriously probably being Planescape for an actual complete full-on world design. But was responsible with Tom Mulvey for some of the initial known world stuff. And then whatever else they felt like needed to be done for any number of other games.
I've never actually done, say, world development for TSR. I ended up, I started in doing fantasy games in college, published the Dungeoneer fan magazine. So that's kind of starting developing worlds. By the way, just a pitch, you can get that at Black Blade Publishing, the first issue. Worked at Judges Guild for a year. Ended up going into video games.
Which was responsible for actually much of the good Judges Guild product.
I think I'm contractually not allowed to say otherwise, but to say what Zeb just said. But I did Dark Tower and Caverns of Thracia and a couple other pieces for Judges Guild. Produced one of the first source books for Chaosium for RuneQuest. Griffin Mountain. Went into video games again. After that I went into video games. Was there for a few years, then freelanced afterwards. Ended up eventually at TSR. I was the line artist on Mystara and eventually D&D and Dragon Dice while I was there. So that was a little bit of world development. Then into video games again with id Software on the Quake projects, and then Age of Empires and Halo Wars with an ensemble.
I forgot the video game part too. Yeah, I went off and did video games after TSR. Was the lead designer on City of Villains, and it was the best Barbie dress-up game ever done for superheroes.
I loved it. I was sad when it went away.
And then for the last 10 years, I've been working on Elder Scrolls Online as one of the content leads, and was responsible for a lot of the zones that came out after release, like Orsinium, Morrowind, and the latest two chapters, Morrowind and Somerset. So yeah, a lot of world, it's working within a defined world, but there's still a lot of world building going on in there.
So kind of the basic idea I had for this panel, and kind of the first question I want to ask both of you to start with, is, and I'm really interested in hear your perspective, because both of you started very early on in the history of RPGs as a published game and are still working in games today. And so I wanted to kind of capture maybe some of this evolution of it. D&D as a game started with a basic idea of a city and a dungeon. And now the idea of a role-playing game. If I was to publish a role-playing game today and say, here's my city and here's my dungeon and that's it, you'd either be labeled incredibly retro or no one would take it seriously. How did we go from city and a dungeon to not just expansive worlds, but societies, cultures? So you mentioned working on RuneQuest, Griffin Mountain being a very fully fleshed out setting, the Planescape being, I think you were to show Planescape to tabletop gamers in 1978, I don't think they would know what to make of it.
I'm not sure I would have known what to make it even now.
So talk to me a little bit about your experiences, with the worlds that you worked in games, and how those sort of expectations changed over the years from worlds that were very straightforward, very much point A to point B, and now let's just start exploring our dungeon, to fully fleshed out worlds that players and DMs can explore.
Frankly, the interesting thing here is I think that RuneQuest was in many ways a pioneer for this.
Yeah.
In that D&D came out, we were doing modules, but we didn't really think about we needed to create kind of a whole world setting. And then this whole Glorantha thing is going on, meanwhile, over here subversively elsewhere.
Well, I think I found RuneQuest right after college, and the Brown Rules, the year it came out in 1978. But I know the Judges Guild had already been starting to produce their
the city-state thing.
the
Oh my
world
God,
of the
yes.
city-state, and Bob Bledsaw had this massively mapped out, in installments, massively mapped out world, but it really was. It was still just an extension of the idea of vanilla D&D, which I have a lot of encounters out there. I'm using the basic rules. There's nothing. I'm not really creating a unique culture. And I know even in my world, my early stuff with the Dungeoneer, I was just creating adventure locations. And what lay beyond was assumed that we were dealing with what the play, whatever an individual DM put in their world. And I know that people at that point were already starting to create, vast, generic, medieval societies, and which is basically what Judges Guild was. And I'm gonna make probably a broad statement and get pushed back, but so was Greyhawk. So was
Greyhawk
Forgotten
was
Realms. They were all these, and even Known World. They were Known World. Actually, I'm going to say started putting some real texture on civilizations.
Started to head in odder places that they could, yeah.
But RuneQuest came out of Greg Stafford's imagination of a Bronze Age fantasy world, and it already existed prior to him working with a couple of RPG designers to make those into rules. So his Glorantha came out was Red Moon, White Bear, Red Moon was his story of this epic battle going on in his Bronze Age semi-focused. There was a lot of influence from terrestrial Bronze Age, but the cultures were all his. The gods and demons were all his. There wasn't an Egypt. But there was very much Mediterranean influence in his deities. And RuneQuest just said, "Wow, this is they made RuneQuest, but this is just this great world, and we're going to set our RuneQuest worlds on it." And that was when I discovered that in 2000 or 1978.
Yeah,
this was like 1978. This was mind-blowing for me. Now, also to understand there was Chivalry and Sorcery and Tunnels and Trolls were a couple of the big games at the same time.
there were a lot of early attempts. So at TSR, we had this kind of unique thing. We had Greyhawk, and it was very much like I said. It's very much based on European medieval fantasy, and it has some decent historical grounding bits because Gary was very much into historical stuff, and it was based off of what they had done with his early gaming groups. But the thing about Greyhawk was Gary's world. And so the rest of us had to kind of, tread carefully through it. We would create adventures that were technically set in Greyhawk, but most of them were never really very well defined or never really like, oh, now we're going to do, I think the Slave Lords was the most integrated thing that we did for a long time that felt like it was, here is within a place, and we, defined it out even more. And because he was protective of Greyhawk, and that's actually one of the things that led to the creation of Forgotten Realms eventually. But even before Forgotten Realms, the things that happen is you start creating these little spaces, and then something like Glorantha came out, and it was like and Chivalry and Sorcery, which was this attempt to be very historically medieval kind of a stuff, and kind of unplayable, unfortunately, because of that. But you basically realize you wanted to start like, oh, people, your players start to have like, hey, we want to go here. The thing that we didn't know at the time is we knew we could sell modules. We could make a module and we could sell that, and that's what the market wanted. We did this little, the Greyhawk world thing and the binder thing, and it did okay. It didn't really, because a lot of people go like, well, I don't play in Greyhawk, right? And for us, figuring out worlds really and how to really create worlds and went kind of hand in hand with figuring out how to turn them into kind of a whole package and line that then would people would really, because if you're going to create a world, you have to support it. You have to provide product for it. You have to provide, more stuff. Otherwise, it's just like, yeah, I did a world and people looked at it, oh, that's nice, and then they moved on.
But they grab a city, a location, and they don't really run the world. They just run the locations in it.
And we fully expected for a lot of things we put out like that people were buying them to incorporate into their own campaign. And we viewed that entirely with modules. It's like, let's try to make this so it can be fit into whatever setting you're doing. And that tended to make them bland around the edges. We could have a very detailed story in the center and all that, but the rest of the world was kind of and then you go to the there's the village with the local baron over here, and that's about all you say about him. What do you really know about the village of Hamlet? Not a whole lot.
Sorry, I just want to ask a quick question. Sorry, just both of you mentioned sort of the influence of history, like historical, cultures. Was that a natural place for DMs at the time and designers to go, or do you think it was some of the influence of wargaming at the time, being a hobby that role-playing kind of stepped out of, that history was something that people would naturally turn to, rather than, say, creating something more whole cloth, like, like the Wizard of Oz or something like that, where it's much more coming directly from the imagination versus looking for historical grounding to start from?
So I think it came from two principal areas. For me, it came from historical, because I'm a historical fan, and then you try and find ways to kind of fantasize that up, and but you look at interesting cultures in the world, and then say, how can I use that? The other one that a lot of people were doing was basically going to some of their favorite fantasy stuff and saying, hey, I want to make that world. You ran into two problems. If you made basically one that was just like, hey, I've made the world of such and such, well, then, you've got like licensing issues, so that would be a real big issue. That kept those from being kind of commercially available, but a lot of people did it. Or you wound up with a lot of things that people complained about. Well, that just looks like another Tolkien kind of, look-alike ripoff kind of a thing. And so it kind of starts, and it really takes a while before, people can really say, I'm just going to make something complete from whole cloth.
I think one of the issues is that the original D&D, you can see so much of its source being in Lord of the Rings. I mean, we hadn't had movies yet. Well, around that time we had Ralph Bakshi, but we had the books, and I think everyone.
Movies.
Pardon?
We had bad movies.
We had bad movies. We had Rankin Bass Hobbit. We had. Okay, you can love it. You're allowed to love it.
I love bad movies
even
too.
Even the Cat Dragon. But we had this history that came out of a very select group of fantasy history, or fantasy history, let's just call it that. This is our grounding in the history of fantasy. We had Conan the Barbarian. I was influenced by Conan the Barbarian.
Oh, yeah.
Dark Tower is a direct influence out of the Conan mythology. We had Lord of the Rings. We had, in some cases, many of us had Elric. Elric was hard to come by in the early days of fantasy, and anything coming out of Moorcock.
Fritz Lieber was the other one too.
Fritz Lieber, oh my God, Fritz Lieber.
He was really great at world building. Yeah.
Yeah, he had a great world, but it was still kind of this. It was a bubble world.
Yeah.
Lankmar was a bubble world, and I think he even knew that because he attached it by bubbles to other civilizations. Because Fafhrd and Mouser actually exist in various points in history, including terrestrial history. Some of the stories are actually set in the Mediterranean area of our world. So we've got this very narrow selection of backgrounds, and I think we all pulled it from that. I mean, just the fact that we fight orcs, the fact that we have dwarves and elves, that's Tolkienian, and treants, excuse me, we'll call them treants, but first books, they were ents. So we have all these
First book,
characters.
they were hobbits too.
And they were hobbits. I think Tunnels and Trolls still kept them as hobbits. Bold, brave, not big enough to sue. So we had this very literature, and then we also had our own mythology, which was the Greek mythologies, the Norse mythologies, huge Norse, the
H.P. Lovecraft mythology.
H.P. Lovecraft mythology, which is real or not.
Which didn't fit with like traditional fantasy, but we all shoehorned it in. We would all shoehorn it in.
It's because that is where the horror aspect of anything you play in D&D is where we figure out how to scare you. So we brought all these in, and these mythologies were all mostly Bronze Age, so it was kind of a weird fit with the mythology, with medieval, which was kind of, now we were dealing with mostly Christian gods, the Christian religion and whatever, trying to superimpose that, because a lot of us, we came up out of that Christian background, and we're trying to justify, well, how do we play knights and heroes when we've been told that worshiping evil, worshiping gods is evil?
Yeah. Did you feel back, like in the 70s, those early days of role playing, did Tolkien cast a very long shadow over everything? Like, because it feels like there's a tension there between Mediterranean civilizations and myths, and yet Tolkien casting, being such a foundation. Obviously Gary would say Tolkien had no influence on what I did, but yet we have Ents and hobbits and orcs in D&D. How much did you see of people coming into D&D or role-playing games in the 70s already knew Tolkien? Was that sort of the baseline that people had, or were there other authors like Moorcock who...
I actually think a lot of people came into D&D without knowing about Tolkien, and then turned to Tolkien shortly afterwards because, this is that... They could see the connection almost immediately. There were frankly, in the 70s, early 70s, Tolkien was popular, but it was still kind of this weird counterculture, kind of like a weird book people sometimes read. And so a lot of people, especially when you look at people who are, probably in sixth grade or something, they were not reading this thing that's full of like incomprehensible names and that sort of stuff until later.
Well, in that later, they say, originally, I think the original foundation for Dungeons and Dragons was the college group.
Yeah.
This was the age. In my group, a number of my players came in playing. They were already writing in Elvish.
Wow, you had.
I had college students.
I had college students too. We weren't writing in Elvish.
My players were already writing Elvish runes and doing calligraphy with them. You didn't start getting the kids coming in until after like 1979, when everything blew up because of in the news. Yeah. So now you start bringing in, and then you start bringing in, your Stranger Things kids, who are grade schoolers at that point.
Yeah.
And everyone starts discovering this bigger world, this fantasy world that existed, and you start bringing in. But by that time, we've already got established. We got the known world by that point, I think.
Not in we didn't really get known world until like in the early 80s.
So I know when Lawrence came to work for me, he brought the known world with him, and it was kind of new to us at that point.
And so it was, but those kids coming at that point, basically, for them, their grounding in fantasy is, their background fantasy is a great deal of it would have been fantasy role-playing games, and then they go start reading and catching up with other stuff.
Yeah. That was very much my experience. So I came into D&D the early 80s. I had seen the Rankin Bass Hobbit movie, which I adored. And then so when I found D&D, it was very much seeing that the Tolkien influence is what cemented that for me. Like everything I'm seeing in this cartoon is showing up in this game, and that really, when I was younger, defined so much of the game for me.
There was a lot of visual. Yeah, you came in with some pre-visualization that
exactly.
Zeb and my generation would have gotten from Jason and the Argonauts, Sinbad.
Oh God, yeah, used to love all those movies.
The Sword and Sandal movies. I still have a game at home that's based on the Longships, the Richard Widmark and Sidney Poitier movie. This is one I still have. Okay, I'm going to just tell you that I'm probably a hoarder. I still have a board game that would cover twice this table, maybe 3 times this table, that I made of pasted paper that was based on running around in long ships. Already talked with one of my friends about doing that actual board as a Kickstarter at some point.
Cool.
But, I was making games, I was making those games back in the in the 60s, and our influence was the movies and maybe like books of mythology and like Robin Hood and King Arthur. So those were the other influences we brought in. When I say mythology, a lot of it also is that the children's version, the
Children's version, the Greek myths, all that sort of stuff.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The
So-
children's Odyssey. Yeah.
So, kind of moving a little bit beyond those first steps, then, what were your own experiences with role-playing game design, and now sort of incorporating, as you talked about, there was demand for adventures, but then you were starting to look at building out more worlds as lines you could support, or working with a world like Lorantha, which had its mythology and was distinct. Did you feel like your approaches to how you were looking at D&D and role-playing games were sort of changing as we moved from the 70s and then more into the 80s? As so the D&D craze sort of fed into itself. It felt like D&D started to take off. You had the James Dallas Egbert case. Fantasy becomes more prominent. We get the Conan the Barbarian movie. We get a billion Conan the Barbarian movie sort of knockoffs, but even movies like Dragon Slayer. Fantasy, it seemed like today we're going through another big fantasy period, but it feels like around 81 to 85, there was a similar surge in not many good movies, but there were a lot of movies released that were sort of trying to catch on to the D&D craze.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, there were the Conan movie came out and made a splash, and then you had like you said, Dragon Slayer and Willow and
Sword and the Sorcerer.
Sword and the
that's
Sword. You had
Better than
Hawk the
Conan.
Slayer. You had a bunch of Italian bad Italian ones that came out and all this sort of stuff. And they fed basically a very hungry market, and they were many the Italian ones and the Spanish ones were awful, but they were you'd watch them anyway, and so. There was a lot of that, but then for us, it was for me, I was always very historical, and I wanted I got to do Oriental Adventures, and it was like me going a little too crazy about being historical, perhaps. But it was finally an opportunity to really kind of create a cohesive world thing. We'd had Forgotten Realms out, but and that's a very cohesive world, but I didn't own it, so
Oh, Forgotten Realms was late 80s.
That's right. It came out. The Caricature came out after Forgotten Realms. That's right. But the Oriental Adventures came out first.
Right.
Before
Yeah.
that.
Because you were doing that. I think when I was at Coleco.
Yeah.
So the early 80s.
Yeah, and Bushido was the other one that was out about the same time.
Bushido was big.
Yeah.
At least a big influence.
It was a big influence on, and it was this idea that hey, I can take a culture, a known kind of culture, and adapt it to fantasy. And and then you started seeing other people doing that sort of thing in a bunch of different settings, and so and for me, in some ways, it's an interesting intellectual exercise.
Well, the 1981 to 1985 period, I kind of sat out on RPGs because I was working on 8-bit video games then. So, but that was actually the heyday of my playing period. So I was I was mostly doing, I was actually almost entirely doing RuneQuest in my own world, my world was not Lorantha.
Oh, what was your world? What was your world?
Some of it was some of the mythology in it, I would say, was loosely based on the Durini novels, Catherine Clark's.
Oh God! Wow! Yeah. People have forgotten those novels. I swear.
Because at that time, I was Christian, and that mythology was a semi-Christian mythology, so I could have good magical elves, things like that. But it was set in what I guess RuneQuest would have called a gateway world, which means I use their monsters, I love their Jaquays, all those sorts of creatures, but I plug them into my own mythology and my own world building. And then on the other side of the coin, we were playing in Lawrence Schick's AD&D world, Lawrence was a VP at TSR early on. He was responsible for getting out the DMG. I think the production on the DMG.
Yeah, yeah.
And
He was the design manager at the time.
yeah, design, and he worked with Zeb on Star Frontiers.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, we heard that story too.
Oh God.
That was one of our ongoing stories when we worked it. But Lawrence was working for me as a video game designer. I was the I ended up being the director, but I was essentially the manager of the video game design group at Coleco. And so after school on Friday, we would all blow off steam in Lawrence's AD&D game, and we played through the Slave Lords modules even before they were published.
Wow. Yeah.
And we definitely played through Temple of Elemental Evil before in a manuscript version that Lawrence wasn't supposed to have. So we were doing our own world development. But then when I came back to freelancing in the RPG world, this was 1986. To work for TSR, I had to insert myself into understanding their worlds. And I worked in several of their product lines. I worked in the known world because I did some of I did editing on first on one of the master level games, and then I actually wrote one of the adventures. And these were all other people's ideas. They weren't even my ideas. It was here's a 1-paragraph treatise that this product has to be.
This is the brief we sold to Random House.
Yeah.
This is what we told Random House we're going to give them. Here, somebody go design it.
And it was probably supposed to go to somebody else, but somebody else either schedule didn't fit or dropped the ball. So here, Jennell, you write this one. And I get a blurb and a fuzzy cover by some artist, or fuzzy cover sketch. And I had no idea what was on the cover sketch. I had no idea. And the blurb was just, it needs to have, basically it needs to have these elements. And so I would have to write this adventure that was set into the known world, and very much like a television episode on a television series that doesn't have a defined story arc. I had to make sure that I was writing so that by the end of the adventure, the world was reset to where it had been.
The world stays the same, yeah.
The world was reset to where it had been at the beginning, even though I was dealing with political conflict and their world leaders. I had to make sure that when I was all done, there was no, it was the same here as it was here. You just had a good adventure in it, and there was some character development. But at the same time, then I was doing things like World of Greyhawk, something that Frank Mentzer had written. I was just from what I misunderstood what the director, what the assignment director said, she told me that, we need you to put these 3 or 4 modules, these RPGA modules together into a book. And I thought, oh, that means stitch them together.
Sounds like to me, yeah.
Well, that's what it meant to me, and I did that. And apparently all I was really supposed to do was just edit the text and put them in the same book together. Not make a continuous story out of them and change the the author's big good guy at the end into a secret bad guy.
Yeah, he probably would have upset Frank a little bit.
Yeah, I heard that later on. But those were the things I was coming into, is these established worlds, and having to learn how to fit my work into them so that I was writing to fit. I did the same thing with Ed Greenwood's Forgotten Realms. I did the Savage Frontier, and I turned several of his pet superhero characters into mad people living in a dark dungeon who had just had too much and were killing each other. I think he went back and reset those again himself. It was that sort of thing. It was, you didn't know, you were just given these briefs and you didn't know exactly
Yeah, Jeff never forgave it. You know, you talk about the briefs and the title thing. This is slightly off topic from Real Building, but yeah, he never forgave me for we needed an Oriental module, and we basically came up with the title Mad Monkey versus the Dragon Claw, and then later on Jeff got it, and he's like, "What am I supposed to do with this?"
You'd be perfect for that.
Yeah, it's like, come on, how can you not do something with that title?
So how did things work behind the scenes at TSR at the time then? Because it sounds like there's a real emphasis on saying you have a world, don't change it, but have adventures there. But it also sounds like kind of coming through, like some of the designers very much had a sense of like, this is mine. And
Well,
you're not allowed to change
so
it.
the world we had mostly was Forgotten Realms, and at that point, and Forgotten Realms came around expressly because Greyhawk was so limiting for most of us, because everything that went into Greyhawk had to be reviewed and approved by Gary, and that was a huge bottleneck, and we couldn't afford that bottleneck. So Jeff discovered Ed Greenwood. He had been putting things in Dragon magazine, set in his, and so he said, Jeff proposed, talked to Ed, and found out, hey, he's got a whole lot of material. Let's see if we can use it. And they made the deal. He sent us his source material, a lot of his source material, which was we want to know all the kind of cheeses that would be in this caravan. Yep, he probably had a table for it, that sort of thing.
I have stories working on Ed Greenwood product, both as a designer and an artist.
Yeah, but then it was our world at that point. It was Ed was free and happy to provide advice, answer questions, give us whatever things he had in his head still about stuff, that sort of thing. But we were pretty much free to. So it became the place to put pretty much almost all our product, which meant that it needed to accommodate just about any kind of setting that we wanted to do. It was, so it ranges from fairly standard European and, Waterdeep and all this sort of stuff, all the way over to the Mad Wizards of Thay, and we wound up putting the Arabian lands on it, and eventually Karatur, and I think Jeff got upset when he realized that I owned more of the Forgotten Realms in terms of design than he did, because Karatur was freaking gigantic.
When I went to work on Savage Frontier, I inherited the fact that I had to have Vikings. I had to have the classic Northern barbarians that were being currently written into a novel by Bob Salvatore.
Yeah. And
I had this vast unknown area that was just kind of ambiguous, that Ed had a few spots. And I got these sheets of photocopies that had literally been made by, I think, Karen and Jeff cutting paces out of other photocopies of Ed's notes and pasting together into a semi-organized format, like all this goes into the North, all this goes into Luskan.
Yeah, all of his stuff was typewritten pages and handwritten notes, and so,
So, I'm getting these, it's just this laundry list of, this is bits of information that Ed knows about his world, and our general instruction is if Ed wrote it, we should at least make an attempt to include it in it. Because it is, we're selling this as Ed Greenwood's Forgotten Realms. So go through that, do that. The one thing I was uncomfortable doing was using Elminster. Because Elminster was Ed's voice. Elminster is Ed. And
yeah, we tend to try to avoid.
So I would avoid that. So I ended up inserting a character that I had created in this just requires a little bit of backstory. People know what SPI is, the company SPI. SPI was a competing games company in the 70s and 80s, early 80s. They went out of business. TSR acquired their assets.
Their ugly story.
That's another long story. That's over drinks. One of the things I had written an adventure for SPI's Dragon Quest called The Enchanted Wood, which was incredibly influenced by Xanth, the Xanth novels, to some degree. And I ended up, TSR now owned that product. And there was no way I was ever going to see anything having to do with it published again, but TSR owned the IP. So I said, okay, I'm going to steal from myself that in a product that TSR owns, and I'm going to put it in the Forgotten Realms. So the High Forest is the Enchanted Wood. There is all sorts of things in there from the Enchanted Wood, and I took one of my wizards from the Enchanted Wood, and he became the voice, the narrator voice, and his sidekick, Eric, became this comedy duo, literally, who were talking about the Forgotten Realms in the Savage North. And I also say, the character Amelia Armenides is my manager at Coleco, and this is a loving treatment of that. His sidekick Eric is our boss.
Not so loving treatment.
Not so loving treatment.
But so the Forgotten Realms becomes basically this kind of hodgepodge of cultures, and the thing is, because it was this space that we wanted to be able to put anything, a lot of times they don't, you'll wind up with stuff butted up right against other stuff that doesn't, if you look at it, it's just not going to make real, historical, cultural sense. But it was like, okay, we got a space, we can do this. I used to always mock Jeff a little bit about the Wizards of Thay as yeah, and then we went out and went to war and we lost. And then we went out and went to war and we lost again. and we did again. And this time, no, we lost. And so it's like, so it was stuff like that. But they provided, there's a great setting where we can kind of do weird wizardly things, right? That sort of stuff. We got the jungles of Chult. They're just kind of down here, over here. And then, okay, we'll do jungle-y stuff over there. We wrote a book, Doug wrote a series of novels that were basically essentially in Great Britain. So we he created an island and we put it out there.
Luskin. Yeah, I had to incorporate that.
Yeah, and then we wanted, somebody, I don't know, I guess Doug convinced him we should add an Aztec empire. So hey, let's put that in someplace. Yeah, and so there were it became a place that held everything, but it wasn't a place that was viewed as a giant, coherent, organic thing, which is why things like Elminster become so important, because that is, those signature characters become the thing that actually tie the whole world together. They keep it from just fragmenting off into completely random little bits, because now you can have elements who say, oh yes, I visited that place and such, and it feels more connected in that way. Characters in that world are more important than the cultures in some ways.
This is true.
Just as a quick aside, just my own curiosity, but maybe someone else found this interesting too. What was the decision to reach out to the Forgotten Realms rather than pull in the known world as a setting? Because my experience in the known world, it's similar, right? You have a lot of these distinct cultures drawing from history that are next to each other to give you a pretty wide range of things to play with.
Well, I think it was in part because we wanted to keep the separation between D&D and AD&D, because if we'd pulled in the known world, then we would have we felt like we would just confuse people again. We confused people multiple times between D&D and AD&D and all this sort of stuff, and Greyhawk and not Greyhawk and all that, if we had pulled the known world into AD&D, then it's like, well, what about all these other known world products over here that aren't AD&D, and so it was much more of a let's do a clear, line for AD&D as opposed to, trying to blend the two together.
And yet.
And we probably still broke that rule.
And then you broke that rule when I by the time I joined TSR in '93, they were breaking that rule because Andrea was massaging the known world into Mystara.
Oh yeah.
So that segues nicely into the 1990s, where we go from a pretty narrow set of worlds in D&D to, we have like 3 or 4 main worlds that are featured, to then in the 1990s with second edition, there's an explosion of creativity. What kind of fueled that change? From your own
Two things happened with that. One with Gary no longer kind of involved in the company. Basically, that gave the design department a stronger creative voice about these are the things that we would like to do, and there was not a creative at the top who was saying no, this is where we're going to go. We still had management at the top, and we had very opinionated management at the top, all this sort of stuff, but it became much more an issue of they would go to us and say, this is what we need to do product-wise. what are the products you want to that we and it was up to us to propose products. That's where all these briefs where you get the one-page thing, because we had to do 100 products in a year, and you had to like plan them out a year and a half in advance. So that you could, put them in there, so Random House could put them in their catalog. So yeah, we would literally all be assigned to write stacks of product ideas. The idea being that if it got accepted with good planning and everything, you would be the person that would work on it. Didn't always work out that way. Mad Monkey versus the Dragon Claw, some stuff like that. But that was the first thing. It was in some ways the floodgates got unlocked or opened up a little bit, so that we got to be the people kind of saying these are the ideas that we've had percolating around for a long time. The other thing was that module sales were no longer as strong as they had been, and what we were discovering product-wise was a better seller were source books, and to some extent box sets. Didn't have to be huge box sets, but box sets that people were more interested in wanting those than just buying a module. And so that shifted the focus of what the company was, now delivering.
So you're going to say something?
I could say, which would explain why Mystara, when I came on, was entirely box sets, almost.
Yeah, it was box sets and source books is really what it came down to. Because if you're going to spend $15 and you got this cool source book that you could I can use all sorts of stuff in here, that became very popular with people.
And as a freelancer, I went back to freelancing in 86, 87, and TSR ended up being my primary design client at the time, and like I said, they were feeding me whatever was available on the schedule, because they had holes and they needed a designer, and I earned my position on the design freelancing roster. And I was getting all these things. I was working both as a designer and an editor. So for one time around, I edited Known World source book, and then the next time I was doing Spelljammer source books, and occasionally writing an adventure. I actually burned out writing for them, so I quit doing that. But getting all this stuff. So this was a very rich time to be a freelancer, except for that one time when they stopped paying us.
Well, rich in memory.
Rich in memories. I think it was right around second edition. There were some financial hiccups.
Oh, there were always financial hiccups.
But they were the kind that made the freelancers go, I need to pay my bills. So when I came into TSR in the early 90s, they were supporting this wide swath of different worlds, and it was too wide a swath. It was too wide a swath. That was part of the problem. I worked for Judges Guild in 78, 79, and when they finally shut down, kind of went away in the early 80s, they were doing the same thing. It was push out as many product as they could, and hopefully no one notices that none of these are as good as this narrow range that was being produced 2 or 3 years earlier.
So part of the problem with basically they said, wow, the box sets sold, right? And they would sell enough to justify doing them. But the problem is that follow-up product for the box sets would steadily decline. And that's fairly standard. You'd expect that. But it meant that when you're putting out a world and suddenly after 3 or 4 supplements or adventures in the course of a year and a half, nobody's really buying those, then they're going like, okay, we're not going to support that world anymore. And so we were firing stuff out in some ways, kind of seeing what would stick almost. Mm-hmm. And so this led to Spelljammer, Dark Sun, Planescape, kind of all these kind of came out in a series. Al-Qadim, all these Mystara,
yeah,
and all these things came out, and we learned things from each one. Like, so when Jeff did Spelljammer, great kind of crazy concept, but we discovered that players didn't view it really as a campaign setting. but more as a tool to get from place to place, and a go up and have some adventures, then go home, and yeah, that was interesting. And so it had a hard time selling, extra product as a full-on continuous thing. So the next one is like, okay, don't make that mistake, do it differently. And only a few worlds really stuck. Obviously, Forgotten Realms, because it was the established granddad. Dragonlance, because it had the giant the giant mountain of book support, and people wanted to kind of play in that world. And then after that, it was like, well, what else can we try? Dark Sun actually got some traction, but not as much as we wanted. Planescape got traction. I'm still surprised people play it. But others like Al-Qadim was an interesting idea. Karatura was an interesting idea, but never got a whole lot. The whole Oriental thing was, and that was the other thing we learned, is that it's really fun to design kind of fantasy settings in other cultures, but players like to go play them a little bit, but they don't want to play them as campaigns as a long term. It's more fun to take your existing Western European characters over there and visit the exotic world, and then go back home. Tourists, damn tourists.
Go in, meet interesting people and monsters, and
Kill
get
them.
experience points from them.
As an aside, that's sort of, if anyone's familiar with the Guildmaster's Guide to Ravnica, it's a product we just did last November. It's based on a world from Magic the Gathering. And one of the fun parts about working on a world of from Magic, where we're like, okay, we don't have this existing D&D fan base that has a lot of expectations. We could kind of tinker with the format, because one of the things we found, sort of looking at market research and stuff, is that people, similar to what you said, people want to go to another world for a bit, then they want to go back to the world they know. So we sort of built that setting product with that assumption that you might play one campaign, then you'd go back to playing your Forgotten Realms campaign or your home campaign. So it's very much tries to guide you in the sense of like, when you're creating your characters, you're creating characters that are really embedded in the setting, and the DM has all the tools to, hopefully, if we did it right, quickly create adventures. So you can play your level 1 to 10 campaign in 6 months, and then shift over to your next campaign.
And Ravenloft was actually a good example of how we approached that. Ravenloft was like, I want to go visit once. I never want to go back again. But boy, that one visit was really memorable,
So with more settings coming to the forefront and being created, was there a sense of, you mentioned getting product briefs, like here's something we need to fill, with something like Mystara, was there like a clear directive, like Random House wants this, or this is a gap we see in the settings we have, or direction we want to go that we think this is what players are interested in? Or was it more driven by, here's just a great idea, and the great idea will kind of carry it forward?
A lot of it was Random House didn't care in many ways. They didn't care like, oh, is this what they cared about? We know books sell. We know this type of product sells. That's what we are interested in. So literally, the way our schedule planning would go, we would get a list of, these are the numbers of types of products we need to do. We need to have, X number of source books for Forgotten Realms. We need to have probably, this many adventures is what we're planning to do for this setting. We had brand managers literally that basically were responsible for different world lines, and would work out kind of like, this is about how many product of what type we need for this. And then that would come down, this would come down as a big list of these are all things. And it was like, people would propose stuff. People would say like, oh, for this is where, and the brand manager may have ideas and plans that had already been kind of, and brand managers were, they weren't marketing people. They were, editors and former designers and stuff like that.
The title I think we used was creative director when I was there.
Yeah, and they were creative people, so they would have some idea of kind of like, here's how we want to shape this. This is what we think will what, but it was a lot of it was a very collaborative process with people on the team. But then ultimately, you'd say, okay, I've got an idea for this. I'll write up the brief, and go do it. So yes, you kind of hoped that you would get it, but if you didn't, you kind of had to like, well, okay, I didn't get to do that. So, for example, Planescape came about because one of the other designers proposed that we should do a series of source books about the different planes, because they looked at, like, we've done these, all of these, complete books for various other stuff, and we could do one for every plane, and that's like a huge thing. And we were going like, yeah,
More leatherettes.
yeah, and it was. Yeah, we could do something with the planes. That sounds like a great idea. We're never going to sell 20-some source books through this thing. Who's going to buy, Well, you better buy a damn lot of them.
Yeah, could I put you down for 10,000 of each, right?
But so then it became like, well, we could do something with the planes. It's an area we hadn't explored for a long time, since Manual of Planes. And so that got handed to me, not the guy who wrote the brief, saying, yeah, let's do a campaign setting with the plane stuff. And then I got additional instructions. One, don't make the mistake Spelljammer made. Try to give it a home. That was a very important part of it. Try to make it feel like there was a home base for this, and where people can kind of, centralize out of. And then also at the same time, it was like, Magic the Gathering was, not Magic, White Wolf was, the hot thing with all of their clans and all this sort of stuff. So, give us some stuff that players can identify to and kind of brand themselves to. And so that was all the factions that showed up in Planescape. And then after that, they didn't realize I was mad as a hatter.
And it came out, and then with the addition of the way the art direction went, it came out very textural.
Yeah, and that was the other thing we discovered with Dark Sun, really. That was where the first time we really approached that in a big way, was team up an artist and establish a really solid look for it with a designer. And so Dark Sun is all not Rob Ruppel, it's all Brahm and all of this, very much. But that was a lot of time spent working with the designer and the artist together. And so when we got Planescape going, I had the fortune luck that Dana Knutson, one of our artists, one of the line artists mostly, had a gap in his schedule, which is like unheard of. And so they said, great, you've got him for a month to do essentially concept art. And the idea of us doing concept art was just, unstrange and unheard of. And so he really worked out, like, this is what the city looks like. This is what all the factions, and worked out the faction symbols. He created this symbol that looked so good we had to use it, and she became the Lady of Pain. And that became then this whole idea of, like, creating a whole cohesive package between, started with Dark Sun, and then we really started, trying to do more and more of that. And then, I actually got to pick out, like, the typeface for this thing. We got very into, like, designing the look of Planescape with a whole lot of the artists, the art director, the graphic designers are all heavily involved in that one.
It had a real. I came on just about the time that I think Rob was starting to paint that cover.
Yeah.
So there was a real texture feel to this world. It had something that none of the other worlds had, which is it didn't feel medieval in any way. It felt a little bit of Oz, a little bit of Victorian or England. Just all these different worlds that people just said, wow, it's basically. It probably just because it was different and had an edgy feel to it that made it very attractive to people like my son, who was a teenager. So you get this world that and then you have this world with this very real texture, which I'll be honest, I was working on Mystara at the time, which I was the line artist for Mystara, and it was essentially supposed to be kind of generic medieval. And so I'm doing generic medieval and watching the other artists working on these really gnarly,
lumpy things.
And say, okay, that's really cool. And Rob was also, as a painter, TSR, this is one of the things I noticed about Rob. TSR necessarily wasn't right for him. He was an incredible illustrator.
Oh, he was.
He was probably the best painter of us all there at the time.
Certainly
But-
the most painterly about
the
it.
most
too.
painterly, but he was also the most unlike the entire rest of us who were all working to fit what I will call the TSR style, which was that look that the big four had established back in the late 80s, the Dragonlance guys, Keith and Larry and Jeff and Clyde.
Clyde, yep.
So I was working at TSR because I hit stride on that style, and they brought me on. So I was able to be that generic TSR look while I was there. And so Rob is doing this very painterly, very, very different looking work.
Yeah,
He
if you
brought
told
that-
Rob, here, we want you to paint a girl with a dragon, he was like, he'd hate you.
Exactly. You know, give us Strahd.
Yeah.
For the new box cover, and it is one of this evocative, dark, emotional piece, and it's Jim Atkiss.
It was one of our marketing guys.
Yeah. That's another thing is if Jim Atkiss on the cover of the one of the new dark Ravenloft box set, I think.
Yeah, I think it was in the Ravenloft box set,
It's
yeah.
very blue. It's a very blue painting.
Yeah.
But that's Jim Atkiss.
The one where he's
Strahd.
standing there very dramatically and, yeah.
And there's like spirits swirling up behind him.
Yeah.
So I don't know where I was going with this, but it was this. One of the things I'll bring in is we're talking about these teams. Is we had these creative teams, and the artist on the line artist was assigned to that creative team. So we're in there talking about what products to make. We're also talking about what these covers are going to look like for these products, and
Yeah, because the other part of it is that, year and a half before, we had to provide Random House with a blurb, and we had to provide them with a color comp of the cover, which meant basically this is like speed painting.
if that, I mean, we would have to go back and design. In the space of about a month, we would design all the covers for the entire product line.
Wow.
In a month, 100 covers, kind of a thing.
And it was more than I could do. I mean, Jeff could, of course, just crank them out one after the other. But we would get the sketches and we'd get those approved. And often they would go out to some artists who were just badass at producing these color comps. Dennis Bove, oh my goodness. Just to give him, if you knew you were going to be painting a painting later on, and you could get Dennis Bove to paint your color comp, he worked out all the colors for you.
So then sorry, do we have a question? Yeah, go ahead.
Was there ever a mandate from on high about stylistically following a trend? Or I guess what I'm asking is, like, in the late 80s, early 90s, when like Games Workshop was having this huge push with the Realm of Chaos, and everything had this now super uber gritty.
The mandates that we got on high were basically, we had our version of the comics code, and that was our big mandate right there, and that just kind of guided a lot of the product. So that kept us from being the uber gooey kind of stuff like that. The only time I remember anything like that was probably, like I mentioned on Planescape, the kind of like, hey, look what these White Wolf guys did. Can we find something that will, have that same kind of hook to it? That was the only time I ever got a really, really like, follow this trend absolutely kind of mandate. Most of the time they were looking to us to say, this is where we see things going.
And at that time, before I ended up at TSR as an artist, I was free. They were my primary freelance client as a painter for about a year or 2 years, and you got into that getting to regular assignments from TSR because you looked like the rest of their line, and so at that point I was looking, well, how can I look? But how can my work look more like Clyde? How can my work look more like Larry or Jeff's work? So that when you looked at my work in the context of the rest of TSR's line, you saw the corporate style.
Sure.
And it's just something you intuited. You learned how to be the corporate style.
As a kid that came up in the early 80s on being able to recognize Errol Otis and Bill Wellman and those kind of things, and that was my D&D, when I came I didn't feel that like kinship with the style. It all looked like it's along, but the character was a little bit.
Yeah, if you, I guess I'm gonna do a little sales pitch. If you get a chance, and it's gonna be on streaming services in the next few months, Eye of the Beholder, the video, the documentary about the Dungeons and Dragons art. A lot of topics like that get discussed because they go through the phase. It focuses mainly on the big four, but it goes through the whole process of the D&D artists from start to beginning, and why there were changes and where there were changes.
That's something for me. It's like you talked about Ravnica, and I was a very big Magic player when Ravnica came out. I actually got the first printing of the Ravnica basic lands above my computer where I play D&D now. The art style that part of Wizards of the Coast does really holds the whole world together. I started playing in the early 80s when all of these other worlds were coming out. With the exception of Planescape, they all kind of looked the same. I mean, the art was...
Dark Sun looks different, too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're close. That, for me, it's like, well, I can pick any of these because I didn't see anything distinctive. The Magic, because of the little pictures on all the cards, they really spent a lot of time, particularly as the later sets came on, of getting the world, and each of the worlds looks enough different that it's distinctive.
That is probably a big shift, especially for Magic, and obviously D&D being in the same company as Magic, learning lessons from them. This idea of you have a baseline, but you need to vary from that baseline to hook people in. That you kind of have some basic elements of Magic, but then changing them for each new world, each new set, so that you're always trying to remain contemporary, but also trying to establish something really distinctive and new. It's interesting hearing you talk about world building, TSR in the 90s, because so much of that, I feel like we've kind of come full circle, because I know when I was working on D&D and the aughts or the zeros, whatever you call it, world building was just seen as a necessary evil. Other than Eberron, which had a very big push behind it, the real emphasis was players and DMs will make their own worlds. So what we're going to focus on are very deep mechanics. And going back to this, I remember working on books like Complete Warrior or whatever it was called. We would add entire new pantheons just because, we want warrior-based deities, so we'll pull a few from a couple settings and invent 5 or 6 more. They'll get 3 paragraphs, and that's all we'll ever write about them. Maybe they'll show up attached to a miniature in the miniature set. This will be a cleric of whatever deity it was, but there was a real sense that the players just want to make their own worlds. The more world building we do, we're just getting in the way. To today, where I'd say across gaming as a whole, there's a real sense of building an intellectual property, that you want your game world to have a story, to have identifiable characters, that you can make a movie out of your game. I mean, they made a movie out of Battleship, right? I mean, that's, but there's a real sense, right, that's, and I really remember growing up, I grew up in the 80s, and I remember G.I. Joe being the first toy line I really got into, because in the back of each of those characters, those figures, was a biography. And that's how you take Snake Eyes, who, if you're familiar with G.I. Joe, Snake Eyes was now that I know manufacturing of toys, Snake Eyes was the dream product for Hasbro because he was cheap. He was just an all black figure. They didn't have to paint anything on him, which you think, okay, that's going to be the lamest figure. But you just give him a story where he's this mysterious ninja that no one knows his mystery, his actual origin, and then all the kids love him, right? Even though he's the cheapest figure you could possibly manufacture, he's now the most popular and the most coveted. Because it's just that power of world building and story. And where I feel like today with D&D, that's much more the emphasis. It feels like it's much more like how things were approached in the 90s. This idea of creating worlds, creating stories, trying to be distinct, and trying to hook people in. And we're a little bit past 11, so I thought we could turn it over to Q&A at this point. And I know, Jennell, you have a game to get to, so I thought maybe
That's at noon.
That's at noon. If we can end around 11:15.
That would be wonderful.
Yeah, so just give us some time to get our next event. So I'll start over here, then work my way across. So
You talked a lot about when you would get a brief or whatever, and you would just have to create suddenly, here's a whole new world. We have to, let's come up with these wild concepts, that were innovative and different than medieval standard settings. Were there any of them in particular that you either knew from the beginning that this was just really going to catch on, or you knew from the beginning this is probably not gonna be one that sticks, because some of them have like kind of cult followings now, like Spelljammer fans. Would you have had any idea, 20, 30 years ago, whatever, that Spelljammer was gonna kind of stick that long, or any of them in particular?
Well, you had hopes, certainly. So some of them you could look at and go like, I pretty much knew when we did Caratura, for example, that, seriously cultural, historical ones, Caratura, Alcadim, they weren't going to stick. But they were things that we would say, okay, we're going to do this, and we're going to support it with about 4 modules, and then and we knew right from the start that we would stop kind of after that there would be really no point in going beyond that. But it would be a nice add to like the Forgotten Realms and help give it a little more color and texture. Other ones like Spelljammer, the hope had been that yes, we can actually that was the first of the really ones where we were really trying to go take with a really big different world, and it just, it didn't do as well as we wanted, so we had to analyze what went wrong. And, the next one out, I think, was Dark Sun, and they worked really to make it much more distinctive, make it much more, and it stuck better. Planescape always surprises me in how well it's held on, because I actually view the whole setting as kind of unplayable.
It's a place you could say. It's a tourist destination.
Yeah, but it's a good tourist destination, and so that, I guess, worked in that to its favor. Birthright, again, they were hoping to kind of really create a more longer lasting thing, and it,
Birthright's actually kind of the ones that I was kind of like, okay, it's yet another medieval setting. I actually was an art design director briefly on Birthright, and we did some fun. I was able to do some fun things with the art style direction, but I didn't really see it as this long-term. I saw it basically as an extended board game.
Yeah, and in some ways, some people had more hopes for Birthright, I think, than others of us did. And,
yeah. It was Birthright in many ways was very much one of Lorraine's projects.
And so you were never certain what was going to absolutely do, but you see, a lot of times you had a pretty good idea. We knew we had something good with like Dark Sun. We knew we had something good with Planescape. You could, and you could see that in the amount of effort we went to put into them both too. And so that paid off in the long run. Other stuff, it's like the fact that Forgotten Realms has survived so long is not really surprising, because there is a place for a big generic fantasy world where you can just put anything and not have to worry about it. God knows computer games have gone in there and everything else. It's like it's handy.
I was disappointed that as an artist, I was disappointed that Spelljammer went away, because it was one of the most fun settings to paint in. As a line artist on Mystara, I'm not really disappointed, because it really was just, Mystara was a rehash world.
From a world-building perspective, you can flesh out areas. That's always fun. But then every once in a while, they have these world-shaking events. And specifically, I'm thinking about Greyhawk Wars and Spelljammer.
Yeah, I'm to blame for Greyhawk Wars.
What's the thinking behind it? And I don't have a strong opinion either way, but part of it's annoying, because here I am running in Greyhawk, and oh, by the way, take a big erasure to the Great Kingdom, because we're not going to do that, and then, like, this is now this. And so it's almost like it's a brand new setting to some extent. Anytime you do something like this, and this goes back to exactly what you were saying about with doing the Mystara, the adventure that basically huge political stuff, but nothing could change by the end of it, right? And it's precisely kind of that problem. We did Greyhawk Wars because, frankly, Greyhawk sales were kind of non-existent at that point. They were very low. And we thought we need to do something to really shake this up and get some energy to it. Well, it turned out maybe not to have been the right idea.
Well, Dragonlance did that as well.
Oh yeah, then I got handed the do the other side of the world on Dragonlance, and it was like, are you kidding? Nobody cares about the other side of the world.
But it's very cool what you could tell it is.
So, but on the other hand, it's like it was a challenge for me. It's like, okay, what happens on the other side of the world that is never mentioned in any of the product, never shows up in any of the novels? They've had their world destroyed and they have no idea why. So it's stuff like that, but. It is the same precise problem we have with Elder Scrolls Online. Elder Scrolls Online is a massively multiplayer game. You cannot change the state of the world. It's simply like you cannot do it because the guy over here who just started has to be able to play the game and has to be able to play with his friend who has played for 6 years. This sort of stuff. So the challenge has always been. How do you do stuff that feels world-shaking and eventful and doesn't change a goddamn thing? And not have the players feel cheated. How do you give them a really a meaningful experience out of that? And the answer is, for us, is focus on story. Focus on stories that are personal. It's the big meaningful thing happens to the NPC over here, but make them care about that NPC. Make them care about you. I can't blow up the town, but I can kill this NPC and have them never show up again. I can make them feel horrible and sad about things that have happened. That sort of thing.
Question over here.
Yeah. What are some of the coolest pitches that were never produced that you remember hearing?
Oh God. Frankly, I honestly don't remember. We had lots of bad ideas, some of which we actually did. I was responsible for a bunch of those too. We had actually it was one of the ideas that we did, and it was because we had all of these ideas that were just too niche for any kind of like really big that we should do a whole. But we wanted to do them, and so the idea was to create a kind of a generic set of rules that we could then put adapt to anything, and that became basically the amazing engine, which I designed the amazing engine. And then I did the first product for it, which was Tabloid. It's basically set in the world where everything you read in tabloids is true, but nobody believes it except, of course. And it was completely stupid game, but it was entirely that there was no product support ever planned for any of these things, but it was let's go do all of these really bad ideas we had. Another one was Fairy Queen and Country, which I also did, which was basically Victorian England with fairies and all these other creatures actually being real.
Metamorphosis Alpha got pitched.
Metamorphosis Alpha was always this poor thing that always wanted to find a home and never could.
Yeah, there was the time traveler one, or the.
I'm sure we had a time traveler one in there somewhere.
That may have been after you were gone.
Yeah. There was basically then the superhero, the kind of dark, gritty superhero one they wanted to do.
Oh, then there was like the 20th Century Magic one.
Yeah, and so there were a bunch of ideas like this, but the problem is, a lot of these things, which aren't necessarily bad ideas is more in some ways execution, but they were just ideas that were never going to find. It's why we never did a steampunk thing. A lot of us really kind of like steampunk stuff, but we just knew we could not sell enough of it.
And there were a couple of products that actually got into at least development stage that probably should have been killed before they went into it. Wild Space,
yeah.
That was the first product I worked on at TSR. Was a board game called Wild Space, and it was Dragon Strike, if you remember the Dragon Strike board game with the video, but now taken into the Spelljammer world, which was now carved away from D&D, as I found out later. So I was painting all these game cards for Wild Space my first 2 or 3 months with TSR, and then the whole project just kind of went out of the way.
Not happening.
Not happening. Too much money to do the full production. And so when I actually a couple years later, and we were doing Spellfire.
Right.
I tried to pitch doing a Spelljammer deck because I had actually designed
Yeah,
one.
I've got all this art.
We've got all this art, and look here, I designed all these cards. Crickets.
So, see, question in the back, then we'll come to the. Oh, sorry, we'll start in the front and go to the back. You already asked in the back. So.
You.
I think, thank you for all the work that you put into these products, but I think even with 5th edition, you're talking about the legacy of Planescape and Spelljammer, they're doing a good job of, like, with Mordenkainen's, you're tied back to Planescape. And there's levels under Mountain now where you have a Spelljamming vessel, and I think the guys in my group that played in the 80s and played the early 90s, that, like, you look at it and it takes you right back to those moments, and you still bring out the books and you go, this was a really good setting that I'm kind of sad it got left behind. Well, like, what's your favorite part of Planescape? What would you say is the one thing?
My favorite part of Planescape is the language and the writing of it. In many ways, I indulged myself in some crazed ideas. The slang that gets used throughout is based off of 15th century and 15th to like 16th, 17th century English thieves' cant, a lot of it. So that was fun to play with. The writing style is, I'm an ex-English major, right? So the writing style is second person omniscient, I think, or limited. It's if you actually look at it, it never directly addresses the reader, but it always talks about you, and it always talks as if there is a person there, kind of a thing. It's a tricky style to learn to work with, but it made for a really unique voice for it. And basically, a lot of it was just, for me, a lot of my fond memories are the production of it. Tony's art, the battles we had with the line manager to get the graphic design the way we wanted it, and that sort of stuff. And so, and then I love the Lady of Pain. I love the big and game side wise of it. The best part I like about it is I can make up anything and put it in, and I don't have to explain it. I just have to say it is, and for me, that's, I think, a great virtue that a lot of settings and games forget, is that this is fantasy. Weird stuff happens that doesn't match to any kind of logical explanation. Stop trying to explain it. If you want to, if you look at Norse fantasy, the chain that holds the Fenris wolf is made from like the sigh of a cat and a few other weird things that, like, what the hell? How does that make a chain? Doesn't matter. It does.
Those cats are scary.
Yeah.
And it made one of the best video games ever, Planescape Torment.
Yeah. They embraced it well, and that was the advantage of one of the guys had worked, Colin had worked on it, and the other guys were very much liked the whole thing, and they went with it well.
Is the question back?
So when you're designing worlds and even Forgotten Realms stuff would be a little different, are you constrained by the rule set that you have? Because if you read novelists, like a lot of novelists today, they build a series, they build a magic system from ground up that's different than other magic systems. Brendan Sanderson do a burn metal and do Allomancy and Bloodstick. But D&D has got this Vancian origin magic system that you can have an Arabic wizard, but he's casting third level spells from the book. So how constrained are you by that? And how do you work around that when you're trying to make the world a little bit different?
I know for 5th ed at least, we start with the story, and then we rely on the rules to then, if necessarily, shift to match the setting that we're reflecting. It's part of why you've seen us we're doing a lot with the Forgotten Realms, because it was built using the D&D rules were part and parcel with it. And then as we're looking at moving on to other settings, we've been kind of slow about it, because we want to make sure we're capturing the feel and making sure it feels like the world's really coming to life. So for us, it's very much story and world first, and then find a way for the rules to reflect what you feel should be happening within the world itself.
Yeah, and that's a core problem. There are some fantasy settings that'll just basically, or that won't work with a given set of rules. It's just gonna, it's the two are so off from each other. The good example of kind of how to having to adapt is the Oriental setting stuff that I did. I had to basically create kind of whole new character classes and work out a whole bunch of things that were modifications of the rules. Not like, it's not like throw everything out because you need these things to all work together, but how can I take what's there and find a way to modify that rule in a way that seems like it's sensible for the new thing? Oddly enough, the science fiction is the one that has this problem in the biggest way. And it's kind of like, we theorized for a long time about this at TSR, but it's why you've never seen a really successful generic science fiction game. Because in science fiction, what you do is you choose really upfront, this is what is, and this is what cannot be. And that's like a hard rule, like, you know, the technology is this, and therefore you can never do these things, right? And once you've chosen, you know, you can't take a Star Trek universe and say, now I'm going to do Terminator in it. You know, it just doesn't work. And so they are even more limiting than fantasy. Fantasy, you can get away with, like, you know, I can rationalize anything. I think Jeff Grubb once referred to us as masters of rationalization when it comes right down to it.
Question, right?
Mine actually is kind of piggyback on it. The science fiction thing also ties in. I talked with Mark Miller on Thursday, and that was the second game in my childhood, Traveler. And one of the things that was interesting to me, because I've been rereading old D&D and old Traveler, is we didn't have Third Imperium from Traveler. We had hints of Greyhawk, maybe in the DMG, but there was an implied world setting from the initial rule set, you know, as the assumptions, and you sort of talked about that, but I lost my question. How did the rule set inspire you to, you know, create some stuff? Was that a source of creation or a hindrance when you were?
It was both. I mean, basically, every rule set works off the assumption of you have to start from some assumptions. What am I trying to model here? Yeah. What is it that I'm, you know, choosing? So you know, D&D was, you know, very deliberately chose, basically, it's kind of a Western European fantasy thing, and that's where they started from. You know, it doesn't mean that they were a rigid step with it, but, you know, it frames a lot of the rest of the discussion. Any rules that you do, you have to, you know, when I did the Indiana Jones game, it's like, okay, this is a pulp adventure. I am not trying to create a historical 1930s world. I am trying to create a pulp world. The rules have to support that approach to stuff. And then you kind of work from there. The Conan role-playing game, when we did that, you look at that and it's like, well, Conan, you know, magic is scary stuff and evil and bad, and so, you know, that shapes the rules that you choose. You know, magic is really rare. You don't see a lot of spellcasters, this sort of stuff. And so you start by defining that. The problem is that later on, if you decide you want to add some completely different kind of setting to that, that's where you have to start doing the really scrambling kind of like stuff.
I always found that I wanted to design, what I wanted to do with magic in many of my worlds was, okay, I want to do things that the players are never allowed to do. It's, you know, this happened in the world, but it's like overpowered for anything that any player character would ever be allowed to do. So a lot of my history design worlds is always the way back in the past, up to a certain point, magic was more prevalent. Magic was more powerful. It was a richer magic world. I think it was Larry Niven who wrote The Magic Goes Away, or What Good is a Glass Dagger?
Yeah.
But the idea that at a certain point, they used up in that world, they used up all the magic. So I've written worlds where in fact, even I did this in Forgotten Realms, that the past of the world, magic was more intense and powerful, and by the time it got down to where the players are, it's more structured and more ritualistic, and even the most powerful mages individually aren't going to shape the world. And so I've put my big magics in the past, and the player characters are kind of getting the benefit of visiting it. They're living off table scraps.
Question back.
When you look back on all your experiences and what you've created, what you've done, it'd be kind of interesting from your what do you see today that excites you, that is in our today of D&D or 5e and everything like that? And then what also makes you kind of cringe when you see maybe history repeating itself?
Well, it's easier to find the things that make me cringe. The stuff that makes me cringe these days is the endless blood and skulls and kind of, grimdark kind of stuff. It's, I really would love to get beyond that kind of stuff. Because there are whole lots of other stories. There's whole lots of other, things you can do that players will find it's perfectly possible to be inspiring, and you don't know, everything doesn't have to be awful and hellish. So that's my personal pet peeve. You got?
I kind of like the fact that we've cycled back to simpler rules in many cases.
I'm all for that.
The game I'm going to be running in about an hour at noon is set in what's using a system, a version of the original D&D rules, and I like it because one, that's basically like going home for me, and it's a simpler set of rules where I can be a little looser in what I allow people to do and deal with. But the other thing I really like is we're kind of shifting over into some rule systems where we just tell where the rules are there if we feel we want to create a little random tension and challenges. I ran a game yesterday set in a game setting I had created for a generic setting called Quack Keep. And I created my own story in it, but it doesn't come with rules. It's a generic setting, so I grabbed from a more modern game that came out in the last year called Kids on Bikes. And the mechanics for that were just kind of simple, and they're all focused on mostly letting the players tell the story. And then at a certain point, I say, wow, you're going to need to roll dice on that. And they roll the dice, and it gives them a chance to fail.
Yeah.
And in failing, that gives the other players a chance to come in and say, but I'll help you with this by interposing and changing this. And they spend a little bit of, they spend their own cash in a sense of a token that they've been given that they can use in these emergency situations. So I like the idea that we're actually not forcing, that's a bad word, that we're putting players in situations where they're trying to help each other tell the story they're trying to build.
And yeah, for me, the trends I like, and this is actually, I guess, sound like I'm sucking up over here, but I like the direction that 5e has turned back towards. I honestly could never really play 3-3-5. They gave me a headache. They were all about the mechanics. They were all about, and they literally defined failure as failure of mechanics. They did not define failure as, I tried to do something stupid, and now let's figure out what happens from it. They discouraged players from doing stupid heroic stuff, because if there wasn't a mechanic for it, the player was going, well, I can't do that. I'm not supposed to do that. Whereas when you start saying, like, yeah, here are the things you can do, and by the way, there's a whole bunch of stuff that we don't really even know how to cover, but go ahead and try it. You get much better games, and getting players to realize that failure is actually success at times, not because, oh wow, I got the treasure, but because, oh wow, I had a lot more fun. Yeah. is a big issue.
Yeah, the concept of failing forward, like Powered by the Apocalypse does a lot of that, where a failure doesn't mean binary stop. It means that, oh, there's a complication, or you're going to really have to work to get out of this hole you just made, which is kind of starting to kind of creep into D&D a little
Yeah.
bit.
And I like worlds that encourage that kind of a thing too. It's like, if I really want to do something crazy, it might work.
No one remembers the adventure that everything went right.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, no.
So a question over here, then here.
No, you were first. Just that, growing up, coming into it in the 80s, I guess with the second waivers or whatever, it was just a given that the contract that you had at the table was that the GM's arbitration was all final. and you didn't have to, you could bicker a little bit, but the whole rules lawyering thing didn't seem to be.
Oh, they rules lawyered, trust me.
But where for rule rather than the systems began to embrace that and start to coddle the notion of the mechanic over the session was what drove me away from mainstream D&D for 2 decades. You know, it made no sense to me. Now, the edition seems to be embracing that again. It's
Yeah,
nice.
it's definitely the
Not to
intent.
mention giving game masters that permission. I guess modern kids need permission to do things, and that you can just invent things on the fly. You can just what you say goes. You know, what makes it, if everyone's having fun, you're doing it right.
If you think
That
of,
seems to be
yeah,
back again.
if you think about it, as children, the way we play, we were role-playing games as children. We would, if we were playing Army or Cowboys and Native Americans.
Don't think I called it quite that long.
Yeah, I know, but we were cops and robbers. We had an arbitrary system of, okay, you know, I point my finger at you or my stick or my plastic gun and I say, bang, I got you. And then you have to decide whether or not, yes, that happened. So we didn't actually have rules, but we had play. But then when we got to be adult, to simulate that same, we suddenly needed to have the structure imposed on it, that to get that same sense of fun and play, we had to, okay, but I have a random chance on it using a random number generator that says, okay, well, I failed or succeeded, not a general agreement that my action was successful or your action failed.
Yeah. Sure.
I actually have 2 things. I have a comment and then I have a question. Zeb, a minute ago you were talking about the question was what things make you cringe, and you said it's the very grimdark thing that's very prevalent, especially like in sci-fi today. There's a lot of sci-fi that is the dark apocalypse future and, you know, all of these things. There's a new show on television called The Orville, and the creator of it has specifically said he wanted to have a very serious show but much more light because he doesn't like the grimdark in sci-fi. And so I find that that's a much more prevalent thing, that Dark Sun was very grim, you know, and things, and I think contemporarily a lot of people are wanting the kind of the same thing you said, a sort of lighter story that's still very serious but not as horrible and dark.
Well, I mean, you can still have a dark story, right? But it just doesn't have, you know, dark stories don't have to be about how somebody's intestines got spread all over the place.
And so my question is actually specifically for Mike. We're talking a lot here about the history and the rich line of all these wonderful settings that we've had over the years. And now in 5th edition, y'all are doing a wonderful job of going back, and especially in the core books, like presenting, like when they talk about elves, they say in Dragonlance they're called Kaganeski, in, you know, Eberron they're called this, and Forgotten Realms they're called this, in Greyhawk they're called the Brugash. And y'all have presented various forms of, like, Ravenloft was one model, you know, and Ravnica is a very different model. So I realize you're not going to say anything official, but coming now into where we're looking at settings, if y'all find one particular model that y'all think are going to work, do you feel that y'all are going to continue releasing some of the settings?
Oh yeah, no, we definitely want to keep rolling out the settings. The way to think of it is like, you did all the hard work, so we just need to go through and pick the best pieces out.
Vulture.
Yeah, exactly. I'm a cultural vulture, right? It's Gen X. That's what I am, right? I'm doomed to be. But I think for us, a lot of when we look at it from a design standpoint and how to present it, there's 2 main questions. The first one is just when you look at all the D&D settings, how do we ensure that this setting is going to stand out and really stand on its own? You know, to some of the issues you brought up, you know, we have Mystara, which starts to look like Greyhawk, which then looks like the Forgotten Realms, and how do you? So that's for some of our settings is saying, for something like Greyhawk, what is the key thing that you can put front and center that makes it stand out? For other settings, for something like Ravenloft, you know, where it is more, this might be a place more you visit, we can show that off as a campaign you can play through. Now, it doesn't preclude us doing a future product set there too. I mean, that was a very successful product for us. People really liked it. but that's one approach. For something like something like Dark Sun, let's say, versus something like I'm trying to think of a good example that comes to mind. Kind of like how we approached about Ravnica, where it's very much like you run a campaign here and then you move back to more core D&D. Then maybe you go back for another campaign. That I think fits well with a campaign, maybe like Dark Sun, where it is in that middle ground. It's enough of a world with a story arc that you'd want to explore, that maybe you want to go from levels 1 to 10 or 1 to 20, eventually like, take down a Sorcerer King. But again, when that campaign wraps up after your 6 months to 2 years, then you're ready to go back, maybe the Forgotten Realms or your own campaign setting. So I think a lot of it comes down to thinking about how are Dungeon Masters and players going to approach it. And I think that means we're not really necessarily going to say, well, here's the model and just put everything into that model. I think it's really about taking a step back and thinking about the, in games, you have this idea of like a play loop. Like if I'm playing your game, what is it that I experience? For a campaign setting, I like to think of it as like, what's the campaign loop? Like in the classic, like if I'm just going to take what's in the book and just use that, put as little effort as I want as possible into making my campaign. And not necessarily in a bad way, like it just might be busy or just here's the default. Then what does that product need to give you to support that? And then what's the scope of what we're presenting? So it really comes down to looking at what's the key feature of a setting, which may or may not be something that's answered, and then saying, now, what does the classic campaign look like? And then how do we give you then the tools to then, especially for like, all the teenagers coming into the game these days, how can they just buy that one product and then start playing? Because it's interesting you mentioned like in the 90s when you had like the strong support for the settings, we've actually found players today are not as happy with that. They want just that all-in-one product. And I think a lot of that is coming from when you just have so many games out there now. Like I remember back in the 90s, I would go to the hobby store, I'd buy that month's D&D product and maybe some Warhammer minis, and then maybe I'd buy like one PC or Nintendo game that month, and that kept me busy. Where now, where you have your phone, you have online games, which are basically like, this is now my hobby, right? I can play Elder Scrolls Online is my hobby, right? That's like, every night I'm logging in for a few hours, right? I think now there's just a lot more demands for attention. So younger players like, I'm just gonna buy this thing and then I'm done. I'm gonna play the heck out of it. I may play it for hours, but I don't feel like I need to. I like to think of it as, people want to go on a date with a product. They don't necessarily want to marry it and have to put a lot of maintenance into it, right? Where it's like, But I think you're seeing that too with yeah, exactly, yeah. But I think you see that a little bit with comics too, where like the single issue sales are struggling. I mean, last I checked, it's been a while, but where graphic novels seem to be more where people are buying. Where if I want to keep up with The Walking Dead, I can just go buy a collection of the major story arc, read the story arc, I'm done. I'm not waiting for that next issue to come out. Binge watching TV. The new season of Stranger Things comes out. I'm gonna set aside my Saturday, watch every episode, and I'm done. And I think that's just where people are, because I can set aside a Saturday, make that my Stranger Things Saturday. Maybe I have friends over, 80s theme kind of thing, and then we all watch it. But then on Sunday, I might be watching football. I might be doing something else, right? That might be, we're going to the museum. I can kind of take my time and categorize it more easily, rather than thinking, okay, every week I need to set aside time to do this. So
that data that y'all have got has sort of led to like why Ravenloft just had like that one big product and why
Yeah,
Ravnica has
exactly.
one big product.
Yeah, our biggest revelation, if you look at the 5e product line, we're doing 3 or 4 books a year, was back when we were doing the playtesting. So the playtest had 2 purposes. First, to make sure the game we were making was good. Like, people liked it. It didn't suck. But the other half was to get to know, hey, who's playing D&D and how are they playing? And the biggest eye-opening thing when we were looking at the product line, like how to plan it out, was I think the average, when we asked people, how many products a year do you want to buy? The number was something like 0.94. It wasn't even 1. And so that's when our audience is far different than what we expected and what we've been doing. So a question here, over here.
So just a quick comment, like for me, I've been playing since the early 80s, and like some of the stuff Jennell did, like I ran these 2 guys through parts of Crystal Mountain, and then recently we're helping each other like fix extrusion problems on 3D printers. So it's like I just keep people like I ran stuff ages ago, and then I run into them online in a 3D printing hobby group, and we're helping each other on something. This question, I do a fair amount of AL DMing these days in my local game store. I started doing it to give my younger daughter a place so she could play and learn D&D. My older daughter does it, and to get her into it as well. And I have a lot of 10 to 13-year-old boys and girls, and lots of girls compared to when I started. They all want to start their own campaign. They learn to play with a couple games of AL, and I always tell people in the speech at the beginning, AL is if you don't have a regular group, but a regular campaign is more fun. Find some friends, start a campaign. They ask me, like, what should they do to start a campaign? I have advice, like, this is on world building, which is a whole world. What advice would you give them versus build a whole world? If you're just starting and you want to get, like, 4 of your friends to play with you, but you want your own little thing.
Start small.
Yeah.
Start, go, you got your 4 of your friends, basically don't try to build out a whole great big space, and then, because what you wind up with is a whole great big kind of bland space. Start with okay, I know kind of what, I know what this kingdom is. This is a so-and-so kingdom. All right, here is the tower they're at. Here is the dungeon they're going to go to. Oh, wait, they're going to need to go someplace else over here. How does that fit in with my bigger picture? Put that in. And then let it kind of evolve out naturally. At some point they're going to say, well, we want to get at a ship and go someplace. And you go like, oh, well, where would that ship be? The other part of it is listen, have them, they should be listening to what their players want to do and build a world that kind of that gives their players those opportunities. And that's, their players all may, if they're young, their players all may want to immensely powerful and stuff usually. But, you figure out, what's a path to that, and you can make it hard.
I
But
guess I could say that, because we sell product, right? I mean, I'm a Hasbro shareholder, actually, too.
keep selling product.
So you want to do a world book. I mean, the Ravnica book, actually, I liked. I mean, the people complaining of magic across the I thought it was well done, and it fits the theme well. But you're a new player. When I started, there was nothing on the shelves other than the Giant series or whatever. I mean, there's no world. It's set in Greyhawk, a village of Palma. Today, the new DMs, they go out, and there's whole books, so this thick, right? I mean, here's all the details you can never imagine about the world. I try and tell these young people that are starting to play, I say, hey, they got a whole team, a company behind them.
Yeah.
That's why they can do a book like this. You should start with a village with a couple of story hooks in a dungeon off in the wilderness a little bit, and then whatever your players do, build around that, and eventually you'll get a book this thick if you play long enough.
Well, that's
But they see, I don't see enough of that messaging to new players that you don't need as a starting DM to create a world that's like this. Because you sell this, right?
I'm gonna shill for a book I just participated in, Your Best Game Ever, from Monty Cook Games. I just finished my contribution for that. But it's basically how to be a good GM. And I'm just gonna my basic standpoint is what everyone's been saying. Build a sandbox. Build a small sandbox that's got your the things that interest you in making a world, and then put some flavor bits in it that are attractive to talk about and that might be interesting to those specifically to your players to go investigate, and then build outward from there. Don't say, I have this idea where we're going to go take the One Ring to throw it into the pits of Mordor, and that's what our campaign is going to be, and this is the storyline I am going to force on you because I am the GM. This was early 90s design. And
don't tell your story.
Don't tell your story. This is not your story. This whatever you design, this is your player's story, and technically as a GM, you are one of the players.
Yeah.
And you're along for the ride of the story they're telling about themselves.
Yeah.
And learn to love their characters.
This complements really well what we were talking about earlier, where the concept is role-playing. It's not game systems. Game systems simply support role-playing context. And if you can't role-play, but are ultimately just moving down a specific path with the mechanics of the game, that's board games. That's the
Yep.
So, Michael, one of the things I can recommend, there's a great series
If you
on
want.
that program.
Yeah.
We had the thing
About time to
where
wrap.
we make
Oh, we are
a single
at, we're at quarter of, because we want to call it there.
build a small little town, and it's perfect for what you're talking about.
call
The
that
other thing is
concept
when
of
it
co-construction of reality.
Everyone grab a free copy of Stars Without Number. It's science fiction, but there are some great sandbox ideas. I want to adapt his faction system to handle, that thing is amazing.
Yeah.
I tell them all, start with like 4 or 5, like little huddled small village with a bunch of kobolds and goblins raiding or some story that threatens a little village with some
Yeah.
people, and then see what your players want.
Exactly.
And make circles around, because that's how I started. That's,
Yep.
And I just,
How Gary started.
Pardon? Yeah.
The greatest story.
It's
Your
called,
best
it's
game
called
ever.
Your Best Game Ever. It'll be coming out from Monty Cook Games.
Well, thanks everyone. We are at about quarter of, and we have events to run too. So great questions. Thanks everyone. Thanks to our esteemed panelists. I had a
Thank
great
you
time.
all.
We,